much for coming tonight. My name is John Rubenstein. I'm a junior here at UM from New Jersey, and I used to be a walk-on player for the basketball team here at Michigan. I'm only 5'7". I know I'm not exactly what you expect to see when you think, a Division I athlete, but that's kind of what I want to discuss here. Tonight I want to talk about college athletes because there's a really disturbing trend going on in the college sports world today. Many of us are aware of, the huge physical sacrifices that athletes make when they play college sports. In particular, the concussion problem in college football has been really well documented lately. So we're generally aware of the physical detriments that athletes can do to their bodies when they play college sports. And additionally, we've also been made aware of the mental health sacrifices that athletes can make when they play college sports. Athletes are more likely to experience depression than the general student body. So these are all risks, sacrifices, problems that college athletes face. But I want to focus tonight on something that I find even more alarming than all of that, which is that when athletes do experience these physical injuries, or these physical issues, or these mental health issues, they don't report them, right? They don't seek help when they need it. So according to a survey done by the Michigan Daily, 63% of athletes say that mental health issues have affected their performance in the last 4 weeks. All right, but only 6% of athletes say that they've actually reported this to a coach or professional. So that's a report rate of a little less than 10%, compared to the report rate of the general student body, which is all the way up at 30%. So there's a significant gap there. And we see the same low report rate with physical injuries as well. According to a study done by the Boston University CTE Center, only 4% of potential concussions are ever actually reported. All right, 4%. And we see the same thing with other physical injuries, ankle injuries, knee injuries, what have you. Again, we see athletes brush off their own well-being and try to tough it out and not report their issues. So with all these monumental sacrifices and with so much at stake, the question I want to talk about tonight is, why do we see this behavior from athletes? Why do we see them consistently brush off their own well-being and not report their issues? Why do they seem so hell-bent on making it in college sports? When an athlete receives a blow to the head or gets his bell rung, what makes him want to stay in the game for that next play when his brain is at risk? Or when an athlete is going through the depths of a deep depression, what makes her want to keep throwing her body into practice every day and keep putting herself through that instead of trying to solve the problem and seeking help? Now, certainly some of this comes from within the athletes themselves, right? Their own drive and determination to succeed. But a lot of the problem lies with us, right? The huge expectations that we put on our athletes as a society, right? Because as coaches and as fans, we hold out a certain image that we want our athletes to fulfill. And athletes are constantly pursuing that quintessential image or ideal of the athlete that we all create for them, right? Because we want our athletes to be, heroes, warriors, tough guys, super women, indestructible, no excuses, win at all costs, savages. That's what we like. That's what we like as the consumer of college sports. But this is an impossible image to fulfill all the time. It's inhuman and it's unrealistic, frankly. But athletes try to fulfill that image because that's what's expected of them. That's what our sports culture kind of demands of them. Now, what they really are is human, of course, just like everybody else. But we tend to forget that sometimes, and we dehumanize athletes in ways that I'll explain later on. But before I get to that, I want to talk about how I know that this obsessive sports culture is contributing to the problem of athletes not reporting their issues. It's because, as I mentioned earlier, I was an athlete here at the University of Michigan once upon a time. I was a walk-on practice player here for 2 years, and I actually did get to play in a game once. This actually happened. I didn't Photoshop myself into this picture. That's really, all 5'7" of little old me in a game against Rutgers my freshman year. So the story basically is that when I came here as a freshman, I was guilty of perpetuating this obsessive sports culture myself. I put it on a pedestal just like everybody else does. And this ideal of college athletics is part of what drove me to want to become a student manager for the men's basketball team. And once I actually became a student manager, my romantic notions of what it would be like to actually be a Division I athlete and walk onto the basketball team drove me to work really hard to actually try to walk onto the team. I wanted to live the dream, and run out of the tunnel and experience the glory and all the social benefits that I thought that D1 athletes always get to enjoy. So when I was a student manager, I worked really hard to try to walk on. I stayed after practice every day. I shot hundreds of jump shots, ran dozens of sprints, and eventually I actually succeeded. There were some injuries on the team my freshman year, so they were shorthanded in practice. They called me up to become a practice player. But as the season went on, my experiences really did not match up with my expectations of what it would be like at all. Suddenly, instead of being on the outside and kind of fueling the sports culture and throwing all my pressures and expectations onto the athlete from the outside, suddenly I was the athlete, and I was on the receiving end of all this pressure and expectations from coaches, friends, family, a lot of it not intentionally on their part, but I did feel it. Coaches were tough on me just because I was a practice player and I was very disposable and unimportant to the team winning games. But my friends started treating me differently, and it was weird. They started calling me a hero and such an incredible underdog story, and that I proved that dreams really do come true. So it was a lot of attention, but I kind of dragged my way through the season. I wasn't playing very well, and I wasn't really becoming a part of that brotherhood in the locker room that I wanted to become or that I thought I would become. So it was actually kind of a lonely, anxious experience for me my freshman year, but nonetheless I did get to dress in that final home game, and I got to run out of the tunnel and all that, and I even got in the game for a whole 55.2 seconds. We were up by a lot at the end, so they put me in, and I got fouled with 6 seconds left, and I went to the free throw line and I missed the front end of a 1-on-1. So I had one free throw and I missed it, and that was basically my only chance. I never played in a game again. But despite that negative, kind of anxious, lonely experience my freshman year, I stuck with it for my sophomore year. So I was a practice player again throughout my sophomore year because there had to be more, right? There had to be more to the dream of being a D1 athlete and playing basketball at Michigan. So there had to be more than what I had experienced, but as I went on through my sophomore year, it was basically more the same kind of lonely, anxious feelings set in, and by the end of my sophomore year, I actually kind of started to hate basketball. I viewed it became more of a job to me than a passion, which was really sad, but it wasn't until just this past summer, after my sophomore year, when I took a step back and kind of evaluated the situation and decided to move on from basketball. So that's kind of where it ended, and so I had this dream of becoming a Division I athlete, and I actually succeeded, but the reality, the harsh reality of being a Division I athlete was so far from the fantasy that I had conjured up for myself in my own head. And I tell that personal story for the purposes of this talk because my experience with the Michigan basketball team completely changed the way that I view Division I athletics as a whole. I feel like I can now understand it for what it really is since I've been in it, instead of what everyone else hypes it up to be, and even what I hyped it up to be. I got to see how athletes are treated both inside the facility and outside the facility by different groups of people. And I got to witness firsthand all the demands, pressures, images that are thrown at athletes all the time that they're told that they have to fulfill, and how much all of this really, truly affects them. So let's start with coaches and how coaches can treat athletes. So for Division I coaches, everything hinges on winning games, right? Their employment, their income, their reputation, all of it is dependent on winning. And the athletes that they recruit are the vehicles to those victories, right? But let me preface this by saying that I think most coaches are good and decent people who care about the well-being of their players. That's part of why they're hired in the first place. But with so much at stake for them personally, it's easy to see how they can come to view their athletes as cogs or as assets that they can deploy to try to win games. I liken it to how a chess player might view his pieces on a chessboard, kind of as pawns that he can move and control on his own quest to victory. And athletes can feel this, and this can be kind of dehumanizing to them. And it's because of this attitude that we sometimes see coaches put their own best interests ahead of the players' best interests. All right, Scott DeMar is a former USC football player. And in a recent interview, he recalls back to his playing days when his old coach used to read off the names every week of kids who had skipped class. And he would single out the kids who were not on that list, right? Because he wanted them to prioritize football, even if that meant skipping class and sacrificing academics. And similarly, I recently went to a panel discussion by the Fab Five, which is a great Michigan basketball team from the early 90s. And they said that the first thing their coach told them when they came, he huddled them up on the first day, and he said, "I know what I told your parents, but you guys are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that's play basketball." All right, so only 2% of college athletes ever go on to play their sport professionally. So clearly this order of priorities, prioritizing your sport above your academics isn't what's in the best interest of most of the players. But coaches just want their players to fulfill their own image of what they want them to be. Tough guys who are willing to sacrifice academics and willing to give 32 hours a week so that the team can win games. And athletes usually accept these sometimes irrationally high demands because you have to fulfill your coach's expectations if you want to play. If you fail to fulfill your coach's expectations, there's always someone right behind you, eagerly waiting to take your spot. You have to please your coach if you want to play. But I think it's this pressure from coaches that contributes to why athletes don't report their physical injuries. They're afraid of disappointing their coach's image of them. When I was a sophomore, during one of the practices, around the time of the NCAA tournament, I went for a rebound, and I came down on someone's foot, and I twisted my ankle on the way down. I sprained it pretty badly. I was rolling around on the ground. And as I was rolling around on the ground, I heard one of my coaches yell to me to get up. He said, "Come on, get up, Johnny. Come on, get up. You're okay." I clearly wasn't okay. I was rolling around on the ground, writhing in pain. But I heard him, and I tried to play through it because I was afraid of disappointing his view of me as a scrappy, tough, walk-on practice player who's supposed to be in there contributing every day. So the next day, even though I could barely walk, I popped some Advil and I went to practice and I tried to play through it. And not even 20 minutes into practice, my ankle just completely gave out on me and I sprained it way worse the second time around. But when I got hurt initially, and my coach was yelling at me to get up, he wasn't acting on what he thought was in my best interest as a person. No, we were in the basketball setting. So he was acting on his own projection of me as kind of that pawn, or that practice player that was supposed to play through these kind of things and tough it out. And I gave into that. And I decided not to report the severity of my injury and try to play through it to please him. And it ended up costing me. I ended up getting hurt way worse the second time. But so as much as coaches can sometimes act in ways that aren't in the best interest of the players, or they can dehumanize the players, in the facility, when athletes leave the facility and go to campus, all right, students treat athletes in the opposite way. All right, students worship the athletes. Right, students treat athletes differently than everybody else. They treat them as celebrities. And I always found it kind of strange when I was a manager or practice player, and someone would come up to me and ask me if I hang out with the players. And when I said, yeah, kind of, they get all giddy. But no one ever goes up to the players and asks them if they hang out with the managers, right? That would be funny. So associating with athletes is viewed as a higher social privilege than associating with managers or with anyone else. And this always bothered me because this culture neglects the fact that we all have something to offer, right? Not just the athletes. To me, managers and athletes are on the same playing field and have equal amounts to offer. So that always kind of bothered me. Another thing that bothered me with the celebrity culture, on the first day of class this year, in one of my classes, a football player walks in on the first day, and whispers break out all over the room, and the kid next to me turns to me and whispers to me is that kid really on the football team? As if we'd just been graced by the Queen of England or some royal figure. And it's this kind of rhetoric that only furthers the celebrity culture that really isn't good for anybody, right? It makes non-athletes feel inferior, and it feeds athletes the false message that they actually are above the rest of the student population. And it creates this weird social divide between non-athletes and athletes. But it also puts pressure on the athlete, right, to live up to this celebrity image. When people further that kind of rhetoric, it puts pressure on the athlete to live up to what everyone else thinks of them as a celebrity, as kind of a big man on campus, as a stud. And I think that this pressure is part of the reason why athletes don't report their mental health issues, because they're afraid of not being able to live up to everyone else's projection of them, as a celebrity, as a stud, as a Wonder Woman, whatever. I'll refer back to USC football player Scott DeMars. He said that when you're playing, you're carrying everyone else's dreams with you. Now, and that's a big burden to bear, right? And athletes feel that burden. But when an athlete can't live up to that image or those dreams of what everyone else projects onto them, that's a really distinct, lonely, shameful feeling that can set in for the athlete. When I stepped to the free throw line at Chrysler Arena back during my freshman year, I knew that everyone wanted me to be this feel-good underdog story, the dreamer who made it in Big Ten basketball. But when I missed and I couldn't be that guy for everyone else, I had the displeasure of experiencing that kind of distinct, shameful, embarrassed feeling, and it affected me more than I thought it would. So we project our dreams, onto our athletes, and we treat our athletes like royalty. We treat opposing athletes like animals, all right? And no one seems to question this. When athletes go on the road, they're the targets of personal, verbal attacks that aren't accepted anywhere else in society. All right, so take Michigan football games, for example. This is what happens every time the Michigan defense gets a stop on third down, all right, and forces the other team to punt. The whole student section all at once, they point their arms back and forth at the quarterback who's just failed, and is walking to the sideline. They point their arms back and forth and they chant, "You suck, you suck." You guys know the chant if you've been to the football games. So they chant, "You suck, you suck, you suck," and it crescendos to a big final, "You suck, bitch." Yeah. Thousands of smart kids on a campus that denounces sexist language all simultaneously point their arms back and forth at the quarterback, tell him that he sucks, and they call him a bitch. All right, thousands of kids. Now, is that wrong? No, says our sports culture. It's not wrong because it's a sports game and the standards are different. Now, there has been some debate in the past about getting rid of the "You suck" chant, but the discourse around this conversation always just centers on whether it's a good enough chant. Some people don't think it's creative enough, it's not witty enough, it's too simple, "You suck." But there's not even a conversation about the glaringly questionable ethics of thousands of people pointing at one person and simultaneously calling him a bitch. And that kind of dehumanizing the opponent is, furthering within the athlete his own, bad feelings of self-esteem. We forget so often that there are people underneath those uniforms. And you wouldn't go up to someone on the street who's just failed a job interview and go up to him, point at him and say, "Hey, you suck, bitch." That would be ridiculous, but that's what we do in our sports culture. And we do it with thousands of people at once. And another thing that I'll hear at Michigan football games, when the opposing running back gets the ball for a carry, I'll hear someone, a few rows behind me say something like, "F him up," or, "Kill that mother." And to me, this is in incredibly poor taste in and of itself. But especially given the research that's been coming out about CTE and concussions, athletes have died from CTE that they develop by sustaining these big hits in football games. So that bone-crushing tackle that guy is cheering for could actually kill him or contribute to something that eventually kills him. But all this fan behavior, that seems ridiculous when I talk about it here, it's not only accepted in our sports culture, it's actually encouraged. We view opposing athletes as targets for our own fan catharsis, which to me is pathetic, but we do it. And again, we so often forget that there are people underneath those uniforms. So we've gone too far in our sports culture. All right, all three of these groups, coaches, students, and fans, are all partly responsible for creating and feeding into this obsessive sports culture that the athlete is forced to operate within. And this system caters to what the coaches want, what the students want, what the fans want. But no one in this system is really looking out for the athletes. Right? Not even the athletes are really looking out for themselves, as we saw in the earlier statistics. So all three of these groups throw their high expectations and demands into the sports culture, which projects it onto the athlete. And those expectations that these groups are throwing in are so high that athletes are harming themselves just to try to fulfill them. All right, so we need to change, and this system needs to change. One of the things that I think would be helpful is if athletes unionize, and that's a really uphill battle, but that's in its beginning stages at Northwestern in particular. Another thing that I think needs to happen is that the NCAA needs to lower their hours limit, because right now the average athlete spends 32 hours per week devoted to their sport, which is too much to ask. But what can we do as a community, right? What can we do as coaches, students, and fans? I think the biggest thing is that we stop demanding that athletes fulfill our image of what we want them to be. All right, they're not a service for us. We need to start treating and seeing the players as people first, and not as athletes. All right, because we dehumanize them and we're quick to idolize them on campus, but we need to start caring for them on an individual level, the same way that we'd have empathy for any other human being. All right, if we demanded less of athletes as a society, then maybe they would demand less of themselves, and feel free to be more human, to be imperfect. Maybe if there wasn't so much pressure on them, they'd be more likely to report a concussion, or to report a sprained ankle, or to seek psychological help when they need it. Maybe if the time demands weren't so high, athletes would feel more empowered to pursue their academic interests or try to get themselves on the right career path for after college. Maybe without constant reinforcement that they're above the rest of the student population, we could bridge the social divide between non-athletes and athletes so that they could actually engage more with each other and learn from each other in a more real way. All right, we can support our athletes and protect their well-being while still enjoying everything that we love about college sports, the intense competition, the powerful way it has of bringing our community together. That stuff is beautiful. We can still enjoy all of that while still looking out for the athlete's well-being. But we need to temper this hysteria before more athletes are harmed. All right? Thank you.